Shalom, my name is Adam Wasser from Crown Heights, Brooklyn, New York. Concerning wildlife of Israel. Israel, thank God, the modern state of Israel, believes in preservation of wildlife, believes in conserving our natural regions of Israel. Unfortunately, this only goes so far. Today, Israel is one of the largest polluters of the Mediterranean, dumping tons of toxic waste from its factories in Haifa and other places of Israel into the Mediterranean, polluting the waters. Israel also believes in preservation and is helping reestablish animals in places that they once were extinct, but they only go so far. Always agriculture and industry and development goes ahead of preservation of wildlife, unfortunately. Things like animals like the Asiatic leopard, who only number in the about 15 to 12 in Israel today, um, are looked at as something that cannot be preserved, only kept at what it is at the current level. I've talked to many specialists in the nature circles of Israel that tell me there's no place to reestablish Asiatic leopards in Israel because the land is too developed. But this is unfortunately not true. Fortunately, it is a situation where there is land and areas that we can reestablish these leopards. The problem is that your common Israeli doesn't want a leopard in his backyard like the mountain lions in California. We have other animals like the Asiatic cheetah. Today there are only 24 Asiatic cheetahs left in the world that live in Persia, in Iran, and some say in Pakistan. These Asiatic cheetahs used to live in Israel. In fact, 100 years ago, the last Asiatic cheetah was spotted outside of Yerushalayim in the Judean desert. Animals like the Nile crocodile, only 100 years ago, used to live in the rivers outside of Hadera in northern central Israel. But unfortunately, it is reported that about, I believe, 1912, the last kibbutznik killed the last Nile crocodile. Other animals like the Asiatic lion. There are about, I believe, 300 to 400 Asiatic lions today, all of them living in western India. These Asiatic lions once roamed across Israel, but because of development and the situation at hand with the lack of space and prey available, we cannot introduce these Asiatic lions, or can we? There are other creatures. Mind you, Israel in ancient times was a lot like Africa is today. In Syria there were Asiatic elephants. There were leopards and cheetahs and hyenas. Of course, there still are hyenas in Israel, and thank God they are somewhat abundant. Wolves. In fact, today in Israel there are about 100 wolves living in the northern Galilee and 100 living on the Golan Heights. Several years ago, there are about 30,000 head of cattle up on the Golan Heights and about 30,000 people. Most have 1550 that are Druze and Jewish. Nonetheless, the cattle ranchers up on the Golan do not like the wolves for the most part. They feel, oh, they attack their livestock and eat the baby calves and so forth. So about 10 years ago, I believe, a man decided to put poison in one of the cows' carcasses and leave it out there for the wolves to eat. Well, everything but the wolves ate it. We have vultures that are very rare in Israel. About 25 of them. They're only they used to roam across the whole Israel. Today they're only found around the Golan Heights and the Galilee, and there's about 30 of them, 40 of them. Well, I take it back. I think there's about 150 of them today. But this rancher, the vultures came and ate the carcass, and about 30 of these rare endangered vultures died. Hyenas died. Other animals died. It's a tragedy. It's a horrible situation. The fact that the ranchers and the farmers get precedence over these rare creatures. Israel is a wonderful nation. It's a wonderful landscape, beautiful country. But without its wildlife, without its nature, it's empty, it's burdened. It's like a big giant suburb or city. We want to develop Israel. We want to make it grow, but at the same time we must leave areas of preservation. We must, have some areas that are open and spacious, and of course wildlife. Another problem is that, yes, thank God we plant many trees, and millions upon millions of trees have been planted in Israel. Before the Zionist movement in the late 1800s went to Israel, most of Israel was very burdened. Little short story: the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, when they controlled Israel, they looked at it as a very no man's land. Nobody really lived there. Very few people actually lived there, and it had a lot of trees because of that. So they brought in a lot of Arabs, which became Palestinians, to um, populate the land. And they made a tax that said, for every tree that you have on your land, we shall tax you. Well, there's an easy solution to not paying taxes: cut the trees down. And by the time the Zionist movement in the late 1800s started buying land in Israel, there were very few trees in Israel, and they started planting trees. Massive forests were planted. The whole corridor from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv has mostly been planted by Jewish people. Um, but unfortunately, in those days, we didn't understand that when you plant a tree, you create a forest, but you create one or two, three kinds of trees, and that's not a real habitat for animals, and it's a tinderbox for creating fires. So today there is the idea of creating different diversities of a forest, not just two or three kind of trees that leave a forest very barren and very empty and prone to fire. We think about, when we look at the Bible, the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights is for the most part just barren, beautiful land, but it's barren plains. Well, in ancient times, the Golan Heights was covered in oak trees, all unfortunately cut down. The central hills of Yehuda and Samaria were covered in oak trees. It says, Avram, when he lived in Hebron, sat under oak trees and planted oak trees near Beersheba. So we know that this land was covered in oak trees. Today it's pine trees and Aleppo trees and so forth. Ultimately, we can preserve the land and we can preserve the animals. If one animal should be definitely protected right now, it has to be the Asiatic leopard. About 15 live in Sinai, 12 to 15 live in Israel. Reportedly, there are none in Jordan, and we must immediately do something about this, because we will lose these animals very quickly if we do not start breeding them in captivity and then releasing them into areas. There are definitely areas in Israel that they can be protected, and definitely in Sinai, if we make a cooperation with the Jordanians and the Egyptians with a kind of peace deal, that we help preserve wildlife. There are other animals that are not in Israel but are very close by, like the brown Syrian bear. The brown Syrian bear is very rare indeed. It used to roam across the whole Near East in the fertile areas. Today, it's only found in northern Lebanon and in Syria. There has been stories that the bear has been sighted going through Har Homon in the Golan Heights, passing through. It's never been seen, but it has been said that it has passed by, but it's only passing by. But this animal must be protected. And there's no reason why we can't reestablish bears in certain areas of Israel. If Americans and Europeans can live with bears in their backyard, so can Israelis. Other creatures, live in Israel and outside of Israel that are very rare indeed, that really need protection. The deer, for example, I believe it's a spotted kind of deer. Anyways, these deers, there were about 100 of them in Iran, and before the Ayatollah Khomeini took over in 1979, Israel had some kind of a deal with Iran. And right before the Ayatollah took over, Israel was able to ship out like 5 or 6 of these deers from Iran and ship them to Israel. Now there's a few hundred of them, and they are being released here and there in Israel. Thank God. But there's no reason to. Why shouldn't we establish them everywhere? If all the other countries have deers running all over the place, why can't we? Why must they only be established in certain areas? There are other creatures like otters that live in Israel. People don't realize, but there are definitely otters. There are badgers. There are weasels and small kind of mammals. Another idea is that we have deals with the Palestinians where we share nature reserves with them. So this way, the land's not developed by Palestinians; it's protected, but it's an understanding that it's theirs, but not developed. And this is another great way of of dealing with land exchanges. Um, Israel today has a program protecting the sea turtles, collecting their eggs, letting them hatch properly. Thank God, sea turtle is definitely endangered, and we are working to preserve the sea turtle. There are other things like Israel is a huge migrating route for birds. Birds coming from Europe and migrating down to Egypt and Central Asia and going down to Africa and then vice versa. Israel, I believe, has like 1 billion birds every year passing by. When I lived in Israel about 11 years ago, I lived on a kibbutz next to Beit Shan called Kibbutz Shlachot. It was Bnei Akiva, and I used to see tons. Shlachot, Beit Shan, is in the Jordan Valley, which is the big, highway for the birds to pass by. And I used to see 100,000, millions of birds, all kinds, like unbelievable, just passing through and hanging around in the cow farms and all that. And we had fish farms and all. Mind you, also a little side note: if you want to volunteer in Israel, check out Bnei Akiva. They have volunteering on religious kibbutzim in Israel. There's also other organizations like Young Judea where you can volunteer on a kibbutz for a year or what have you, a few months. Great opportunity and experience of life, and I definitely recommend it. Anyways, when I was living on Shlachot, it's right next to Har Gilboa, Mount Gilboa, where the famous battle of Saul happened and he died on a sword. This mountain, a beautiful, gorgeous mountain, over 800 feet, was a corridor for certain animals, and it was said that hyenas sometimes would go from Har Kamal, the Carmel Mountain, into the Jordan Valley because it was like kind of a highway. So in Carmel, in those mountains, you have a lot of hyenas and different kinds of animals. And when animals get too populated and they need new places to grow and live, they use corridors like Har Gilboa to go into different areas like the Jordan Valley. Well, now that there's a fence that Israel has built cutting off the Jordan Valley and the whole West Bank, it has extremely affected the wildlife of the region. And not only Palestinians are trapped, so are the wildlife. Wildlife has been severely paralyzed by this border fence that was no consideration of the wildlife that would be affected. To me, the wildlife of any place is a jewel. It is a precious jewelry that we have that must be protected and must be preserved. We must protect the wildlife of Israel. We must deal with these issues. We cannot ignore. We have two hands. One hand can deal with the war and the problem with the Palestinians, and the other hand should be able to deal with the wildlife and the nature of the area, and of course economics and all that can be taken care of as well. But Israel does a pretty good job with economics, but not such a good job with protecting wildlife, and a lot needs to be done. Cleaning our Israel. If you go to Israel, you go on the highway, there's garbage everywhere. Israel, for some reason, Israelis like to throw garbage out their window of the car, or make garbage dumps wherever they please, and it's really unfortunate that there's so much freaking garbage on the beaches of Israel and the highways, and it's really disgusting and unfortunate. If we can only learn to treat our backyards and our landscapes like we treat our house, I hope, clean and nice. Anyways, God bless you all, and God bless Israel. Amen.